And it's a quote from the nomination speech given by the chairwoman of the Nobel Peace Prize Committee in December 1968, when the prize was awarded to the French professor and one of the drafters of the 1948 Universal Declaration, René Cassin. And that chairwoman was also Leibniz. So there's actually something that originates here directly in the book, and it's a key chapter that I'll come back to later in my talk. But I will actually start by going back to the 1950s, and this is at a time when Åse Leibniz was the chairperson of the third committee at the UN General Assembly, and as I found out yesterday at the Riksarkivet, she was also the official Norwegian candidate for a seat on the UN Commission on Human Rights. And we are in the late 50s, but we're a slightly different place than this building, because I will start in the world of African fiction literature in the late 1950s. In his classic 1958 novel, Things Fall Apart, the Nigerian writer Chinua Achebe makes a dramatic change of narrative perspective in the very last paragraph of the book. Up until this point, the novel is a rich and complex evocation of tribal life in Western Africa, before and during the arrival of colonialism. The book captures with nuance the strength and vanity, the compassion and the brutality of its characters, and how this reflects the social life of the tribe. But in the very last paragraph, however, the narrator suddenly becomes the British colonial administrator, who during the book's passage has come to control the territory where the story is set. From his view, the complex characters we have encountered fit a much simpler description. He describes them, quote, as the primitive tribes of the Lower Niger, a label that is the closing sentence of the book. With this, Chinua Achebe presented a challenge to his Western reader. In the changing world of the late 1950s, readers could either continue viewing the colonized peoples from the lens they had been conditioned to see them through, namely as primitives in the need of saving, or they could learn to appreciate the dignity, the richness, and the struggles of the people of the Third World. Achebe tells us that how we perceive, how we label, and how we narrate the stories of our fellow human beings shape our fates and its telling of who we really are. When reading Achebe, the state of human rights historiography comes to mind. His challenge remains relevant for how we construct narratives today, including how we write histories of human rights. Narrative perspectives matters, labeling and perceptions matter, and our imagination as scholars and as readers matter. I would contend that most human rights work operates with a flawed account of its own historical evolution. The cause hereof has a lot to do with how historical narratives have been constructed and reproduced. And a major factor for this originated with the United Nations in the 1940s. But the way the narratives have been reproduced in the ensuing decades reflect, to a large extent, relations of power, especially the power of definition in the global domain. So the paradox is that the human rights movement has been at the vanguard of making claims about the universality of human rights, and then gone ahead and presented a discount version of the universality story, thereby partly undermining its own aims. And they have, of course, been aided in this process by human rights skeptics, cultural relativists, as well as a range of political interests operating in the field of human rights diplomacy. But there really is a richer and more complex story that deserves to be brought forward. I think there is three kind of key factors that have defined the standard histories of human rights. And the first one I've alluded to by this issue of going back to the United Nations in the 1940s. And that is that it has very much been carried forward as the story of the International Bill of Human Rights, as a kind of intent narrative originated in the 1940s. So the Human Rights Project that was defined at this point had this intent of first creating a declaration, that's the 48 Universal Declaration, then the legal document, which became the Covenants from 1966 on civil political rights and economic social rights, and then with implementation measures. That was essentially the Bill of Rights. And that understanding has been, in a sense, reproduced as the project and has carried through. Now, there's also another dimension to why we've had these factors that have defined these standard histories. And that is, of course, the legal normative origin of human rights as a field of research. there's been a lot of focus on standard setting and drafting histories. So looking at how the different legal documents came into being. And there's also been another bias that comes in here, and that is a very strong focus on the successful projects. That means the legal projects that led to standards that can be used for legal interpretation. But there's something more going on here. As a historian, I'm interested in the fact that treaties also reflect politics, so going behind some of these aspects of drafting history and legal commentary. But there's a third problem that we need to overcome in this process, and then there's been, again, certain biases, or at least overemphasis of key periods in this post-1945 history, and I'll be talking about this from a post-1945 perspective. And that is that there's been an overemphasis on the 1940s part, and also the 1970s, and we've seen that in some of the recent historiography, for example, by Samuel Moyne that you mentioned in your introduction. And of course, there's also later on been a focus on the 1990s, but I will focus mainly on the Cold War period, and it's very clear that there's been an overemphasis on the 1940s and the 1970s, as opposed to the periods in between. And the problem is that this has, in the histories, privileged Western actors, Western perspectives, and in a sense made the human rights story operate on Western historical time. And each of these three factors that I've lined up has a consequence in how we understand the historical evolution of human rights. So we have this story where we suddenly jump from the 48 Declaration to the 1966 Covenants, and then another 10 years before they entered into force in the mid-1970s. And that's essentially jumping almost 30 years. And that has significantly overlooked the importance of decolonization to the human rights story, because the period in between, especially the 50s and the 60s, oversaw what is probably the largest transfer of sovereign power in world history. And can it really be true that that had no impact on human rights? If you look at the literature up until maybe a couple of years ago, there really is a massive gap, that there's been hardly anything written on the 1950s and the 60s in this story. So that's one of the things that we need to address. And I will argue in my talk here that actually 1962 is a major turning point in this story. And when we see the story from the perspective of 1962's influence, it begets quite a different historical context with a different set of actors and a very different trajectory and causalities regarding the human rights breakthrough compared to those stories that have focused either on the 40s or the 1970s. Then I should also say, and I'm a historian entering this field, as I think you know by now, not a legal scholar, that as a historian I'm also interested in the projects that failed, if they had political significance. And one of the things I will argue is that the Human Rights Project was fundamentally redefined in '62 around the issues of racial discrimination and religious intolerance. So the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Religious Intolerance was probably the most significant attempt in the 20th century to make religion a subject of international law. But it has been completely overlooked in the research literature because it eventually failed out of the process of the 1960s. But it is really telling of this transformation that took place in international politics and international law in the 60s. And therefore we should hesitate of continuing ignoring it. Because it is a fascinating and important political history of this attempt in the 60s to make religion a subject of international law as a convention project, not just a declaration. And then there's also about the attempt to try and shift some focus. We have many histories of, for example, the iconic role of Eleanor Roosevelt. I'd like to introduce you to a man called Egerton Richardson. He is, in my book, probably the most significant human rights diplomat of the 20th century, and nobody knows him. There is, in the book that's circulating, I put a little post-it in just to show you a picture of the man. He was Jamaica's UN ambassador immediately upon independence in 1962, and really played a significant role in reshaping the place of human rights in international diplomacy and law. Egerton Richardson. And when you get the book, you can see a picture of him. What happens when we shift and make a person like him and the context in which he arose and the politics, Jamaican politics and Global South politics, it really shifts how we tell the human rights story. It also has the potential to become a multi-layered transnational story, and I have done archive work in 10 different countries to piece this alternative story together because it was working so much outside kind of the kind of standard narratives. And it's also made me really rethink and go back to some, you could say, or maybe basic elements of historical research, but thinking through chronology, thinking through agency, and also because we're working with law and diplomacy, kind of the making of precedents in this story. And therefore, I will, in a few minutes, start going through this story step by step so you can follow what it is that I'm saying, because these are, of course, a little bit more abstract reflections, but it's also to introduce you to kind of a shifting historiography and how history is bringing in, I think, new perspectives to a wider interdisciplinary field of research. Because what we are seeing is that with the new human rights research that has emerged over the last 5, 6, 7 years, it's making our understanding much finer in its kind of granularity. But we still need to do a lot more to connect the histories in time and space. And this is what I hope to do with the remainder of my talk. So let us start in the 40s. And there, human rights kind of became a very important part of the UN Charter. At least it's mentioned 7 places in the Charter. It's there as a purpose and a vision, which is a fairly strong shaping, you could say, in human rights terms. But of course, it's also negated by other elements in the Charter, very much the sovereignty and the domestic jurisdiction language. But I think what is quite fascinating is that with the Charter, there is this space or field of international diplomacy where human rights has some place in it. And this is, of course, kind of a contestation that takes place over the following decades. What is also interesting is that they actually endorse something in all these places without knowing what human rights actually meant. And this is, of course, where the 1948 declaration is important. I would hesitate exaggerating its importance, but counter to Samuel Moyn, who called it a stillborn project, I think that we have to nuance our understanding of what happened in the 40s, while also knowing that the breakthrough really happened at a later stage. So, of course, the 48 Universal Declaration is a major document because it's there that for the first time we really have an international language in the setting of an international organization, in the potential context of international law, a definition of what human rights actually entailed, and an agreed set of language. But the history after that is then where we've tended to jump quite far. So by looking at what comes after, again, we know the story of starting drafting or negotiating the covenants. But there's actually quite a few things that happened in the 1950s that we should not ignore. And there is a very interesting quote in 1955 where the UN General Secretary, Dag Hammarskjöld, tells the director of the UN Human Rights Program, a man called John Humphreys, that the way he should manage the UN Human Rights Program can be compared to an airplane. And it should be managed at the speed by which the airplane just stays in air. It doesn't crash, it doesn't collapse, but it doesn't take off, it doesn't elevate, just at that pace. And that was by the mid-1950s an assessment of kind of don't rock the boat. Because in the context of the Cold War kind of diplomacy that was already happening by the time of the 48 Declaration, there was not much appetite to push this project. But there were different things going on that we should not lose sight of. And one of the first things in 1950-51 is that there was really a significant attempt by some of the Western countries to do away with the human rights entities of the UN. There is an organizational efficiency review process that takes place in 50, 51, 52, where it's very clear that the United States and Britain, to some extent France, are targeting some of the key structures like the Commission on Human Rights, the Subcommission on Protection of Minorities and Prevention of Discrimination, and even the Commission on the Status of Women, trying simply to do away with what you could call a normative political food chain inside the UN. So when we say kind of that in the 1940s that the West was at least in favor of the human rights project, the Soviet Union voted against the Universal Declaration, South Africa did, Saudi Arabia did, we should also really challenge kind of the highbrow rhetoric of the late 40s, because it's very clear that when they kind of get a chance to do something with the structures of the UN, they're targeting, for example, the issues around discrimination, because that was seen to have an impact in colonial settings of the European powers, and of course also domestic racism in the US South. It even goes to the extent that a British colonial administrator called the Universal Declaration a source of embarrassment in the early 50s. So it's not a project that is strongly backed by the West. It is a non-binding document by design. So when we today highlight 10th of December as a Human Rights Day, we do it very much, we highlight something that took place in 48 because of what happened in the 60s and onwards. So that's kind of just setting this story up. But there was also something else that happened in the 1950s, which point towards what eventually led to this turning point in the early 60s and what I think is the breakthrough of human rights during the 1960s. And that comes after the Bandung Conference in 1955. There is actually, and this is of course debated, but there is quite strong attention to human rights language and debates over this at the Bandung Conference. But what we also see in the immediate aftermath is a mobilization, for example, among African states, some of them becoming independent, some of them representatives who are leading independence movement, trying to harmonize kind of an international policy of what they demanded beyond self-determination and ending colonialism, but also using different aspects of human rights language. And that really comes into play in 1960 at the UN General Assembly. Now, Nikita Khrushchev in the Soviet Union is looking at kind of mobilizing support and alliances with countries from the third world or the global south. And therefore, he wants to make ending colonialism the issue at the 1960 UN General Assembly. And he succeeds. So it is the defining topic. It's also at that point where he apparently slams his shoe at his desk and causes controversy, so the meeting stops and so on. Because he was getting frustrated, because he couldn't get away with the agenda the way he had proposed it, because he presented a declaration that should, in a sense, make ending colonialism the main purpose of the United Nations, to put it briefly. Because what happens is this alliance of 40-some countries from Africa and Asia, and some of them was only attending the UN for the first time because 17 countries entered the UN in 1960. So a large part of Francophone West and Central Africa were acting at the UN for the first time. They changed this declaration into something that actually contained human rights language, and very specific around the issues of race, creed, and color. So this aspect of race and faith or religion is also embedded in this text. And Khrushchev or the Soviets were very frustrated by this, but they had to accept it because they couldn't push back, because there was a very strong alliance of these 40-some states who had actually prepared extremely well to change kind of the elements of what should constitute ending colonialism or the UN's role in this. It's also a process that actually got a lot of praise from the US ambassadors and the UK ambassadors, because they had taken this issue out of the Soviet hands and imbued it with some additional values that ran counter to Soviet interests, and that was also human rights language. So the ambassadors and even I believe the US foreign minister wanted to vote in favor of this resolution, but they were overruled. So this issue of trying to embed in a new way human rights at the UN was not getting the Western backing. It was really a challenge kind of infused by this group of Global South states. Now, this was not a breakthrough, and this was not a turning point itself, but it was an indication of what was to come, because there was much more activity in the early 1960s at the UN around human rights than there had really been throughout the 1950s. A lot of the process otherwise had been these endless negotiations of text for the covenants that really wasn't going anywhere. But this turning point in 1962 that I alluded to, I believe happened because of three elements. The first one was this aspect of race and religion fundamentally redefining the Human Rights Project that had looked like it was about civil, political rights and economic, social, and cultural rights. So that's the first element. The second element is that Jamaica becomes independent and enters the United Nations. And immediately when they're like 3 weeks old at the UN General Assembly, tells the world that we need to get this human rights project moving, because it's been faltering for a decade and a half, and it was fundamental for the way that the world should operate, that it had kind of a legal foundation based on human rights. And then there was a third element, which was a new opportunity for international law. There's a very interesting statement by a Danish delegate to the UN called Helmut Lange, who in 1962 at the General Assembly simply says, the geography of international law has changed, and it needs to be reflected in the political, legal, diplomatic processes that take place. So there is, and human rights in different ways were embedded in this process, because it initiates a new attempt at drafting some legal principles. Because what had happened with decolonization was that there were so many new states who had arrived upon the scene who had not been part of lawmaking. And in a sense, decolonization also meant that we're shifting from an international system of states that were based on empires, or very hierarchical, to in formal terms, at least kind of much more kind of horizontal system of states. Of course, there was many inequalities, but it was fundamentally a different system of state with sovereignty being kind of the guiding norm. And international law had to reflect that also in the processes by which these things were negotiated. So I'll tell you the story through the 60s from these three perspectives, and I'll have to jump a little bit back and forth because I'm trying to do it chronologically. So let me start with this fundamental redefinition of the Human Rights Project around racial discrimination and religious intolerance. In 1962, in the aftermath of a number of anti-Semitic attacks that have been happening in 1959, 1960, mainly in Europe, but also in Latin America, the fear of rising anti-Semitism had come up and had put issues of racial discrimination and religious intolerance on the agenda. But it was dying in around 1961. It was picked up by 3 African states in 61, kept on the agenda, and then in 1962, a proposal comes from 9 Francophone states that there should be an international declaration on elimination of all forms of racial discrimination, followed by an international convention. I'll try and make some of the names a little bit shorter as I go along, because you'll hear some of them a few times, because the legal names are quite long, but I hope you will know what I refer to. Now, the issue of racial discrimination had great interest, obviously from a number of these states from the global south, Africa, Asia, Caribbean, also Latin America, but also from the communist world, who were looking and had also in the 50s, every time there was a propaganda opportunity, try to use this against the European colonial powers and against the United States. So it's very clear that there was this interest in race. The really interesting thing is that there is a parallel proposal for an international declaration followed by a convention on elimination of all forms of religious intolerance that is suggested at the same time. And from where? Which country does that? It's the not so well-known normative power of Liberia, who brings this into the fray, saying that there's a symmetry here and we need to work on both aspects. And they were really hammered by the communist world, who did not want anything done on international standards around eliminating religious intolerance, because at the same time you had to define standards for religious freedom and religious tolerance. That it was a challenge to them. But the proposal carries through, mainly by support by African and Asian states, and then one European country, Italy, who always felt religion, I guess, was important. And this is really an interesting formula, diplomatic formula, because the way the histories have been written, we have plenty of works on what became the Convention on Racial Discrimination, because it succeeded. But at this time, there is a formula that kind of goes both ways in the Cold War. So this North-South debate challenges the East-West kind of Cold War diplomacy, because it was clear that the issue of religion was very much addressing, even though it was global issues, it was very much addressing issues behind the Iron Curtain. And that had the effect that the very skeptical British diplomats and US diplomats at least saw that there was the carrot coming with the stick. And that opened up Western diplomacy around human rights at this point, because there was this kind of undertow coming of this issue. So we have a fast-track process where the following year in '63, the International Declaration on Racial Discrimination is negotiated in one session. At this time, the covenants have been faltering for 15 years, and they do in one session this declaration. And following up in '65, there is in one session drafted an international legal convention on race, which is really what I call in the book the great precedent maker in this story, because this is where we have the breakthrough of human rights becoming international law. And it had been waiting for 17 years since the '48 declaration. I'm going to leave that hanging for a little while, and we're going to go to Jamaica. So what happens when Jamaica enters the UN? They become, within 2 years, the global leader in international human rights diplomacy. A small state in the Caribbean, somewhere between 2 and 3 million population, with a really refined reading of international affairs. And this was a complete surprise to me when I started on this project, because I had not ever heard of this. It turned out later that even the Jamaicans didn't really know the importance that they had played. They know they started something. But what I knew about Jamaica was pretty much that Bob Marley and reggae, really fast sprinters, and then they had a bobsleighing team in Winter Olympics, right? And then I also, because I have a background in the UN, I knew that they were really harsh towards LGBT people, because I used to work on HIV/AIDS issues in the UN. So kind of linking them to a human rights record was not kind of the starting point. But they kept coming back to me in the sources. In the beginning, I was ignoring, saying, that's interesting. The way they managed the Soviet Union, they managed the United States, but it's not my project. And at some point, it became the project. And I think you will understand why when I kind of explain a little bit more. What they said in 1962 was, as I said before, that the UN should get its house in order on the Human Rights Project. And what they proposed, in some ways very simple, was that 1968 should be an international human rights year. And then in the period in between, there should be a program set in place where all these outstanding projects around finalizing legal conventions, setting up structures for kind of an international human rights system, engaging with the NGOs, really mobilizing around this, should take place. And this was really the first time that the UN had an idea of actually having something of a medium-term or long-term plan on this, because it was mainly done from session to session until this point. Now, why does Jamaica do something like that? What were the kind of, what gave them the balls to do it, so to speak? So I had to go in and read up on Jamaican history. And they have a very interesting process of decolonization, starting in the late 1930s with some labor riots that actually sets up a two-party political system with both parties kind of representing trade union movements. So it was kind of a social movement-based two-party democratic system. And even that, just having a two-party system where power could change, was quite different to some of the decolonized states ended up from the late 60s. They also introduced universal suffrage in the mid-1940s, so it was a system where a lot of people had the right to vote. And they had quite a capable political system, legal system, and also many things going for them in the way that they oriented themselves globally. Really kind of refined readings very early on. They're involved in global race politics from early on. They also had very strong non-denominational groups, religious groups that helped end slavery. They had traditions linking them to Britain on civil political rights. At the same time, they were dealing with slavery and poverty, linking to issues that, in the modern sense, are comparable to economic social rights. So they could play the whole palette of rights issues. But what I really, really found fascinating was when I discovered that they, in 1959, was the first country, or maybe after India in 46, that introduced trade sanctions against South Africa. So an anti-apartheid measure. Like the story I remembered was, this happened in the Western countries in the 1980s. But suddenly you had an not even independent country in 1959 introducing trade sanctions against South Africa. And it actually had international significance, because when this story unfolds during the summer of 1959, and there's been 2 years of consultations inside the government led by the Prime Minister Norman Manley about taking this measure, it becomes a controversy involving states on 3 continents. Because the South Africans are very worried about what this means, because if it starts in Jamaica, it could go across the British Caribbean and then it could spread globally, this idea of sanctions against the apartheid regime. So they tell the UK, you're the colonial power, stop your, since you're colonial subject in trying to do this. This is a foreign policy issue. They cannot meddle in foreign policy, that's your responsibility. And the British are a little bit caught between a rock and a hard place. And they ask the Jamaicans kind of very kindly, could you please not do these sanctions? It's creating problems. And what had happened in this process of these 2 decades of gradual kind of constitutional reform, self-government, because they had a government set up from the late 40s, was that powers had been devolved. So there was, even though it's not an independent country, there was rules, kind of semi-constitutional rules. And the Jamaican response was really interested in the context of how decolonization evolved. It says, well, but it's our right to do this. You devolve trade policy to the Kingston-based government. Trade sanctions is trade policy. So we have the right to introduce sanctions against a state that will not allow our cricket players to go and tour in that country. So without any, and they use the human rights language very clearly in arguing the case for why it's rightful. So they had already, as a non-independent state, become something of a player on the global scene. And I think one can read a connection into what they try to do in the 1960s, because there's some real interesting continuities. In 1964, Jamaica then launches its first foreign policy strategy. And in my view, from what I can gather, it's the first foreign policy strategy of any country that has integrated human rights into it. So this is like 13 years before Jimmy Carter, the presidential administration of Jimmy Carter does that in the late 1970s. Very particular reading, again, of 3 elements in their foreign policy. One is the human rights component, the other is the UN as a forum for peacekeeping, and the third element is reform of international trade and aid, so it's more fair to the new states that are arriving on the international scene. Because as they were saying, if the UN is to function as an organization for collective security, it has to be based on international legal order, and that legal order should be informed by human rights. So this is, again, a very small state that are pushing this agenda throughout the 1960s, the UN, and challenging the Soviets, challenging the UK, challenging the United States, and making these alliances with countries that they can work closely with. These are countries like Ghana, Liberia, Costa Rica, Philippines, but also being able to carry a very large group of African Asian countries that were interested in this project at this time. So I'll leave that hanging as well. Because the third element then gets underway, and this is about trying to potentially redefine the UN Charter, or landing in a way that kind of the new process of kind of elaborating international law falls in line with the Charter provisions. So there's this process that takes place in the 64, 65 up until 1970, where the whole kind of broader aspect of international law is discussed. What is really interesting in that process is the emphasis on universality. That this geography of international law that changed had also created a possibility for universality. The UN functioning as a universal organization, searching for solutions that were for all states around the globe, but also how notions of human rights universality were being very strongly echoed in these types of discussions. So there was, in a sense, a great potential looked at upon the United Nations. And some of the historians who've been writing on this have been saying, though, the anti-colonial movements were not human rights movements. And that's not the right way to assess this, because you can't just say all these movements from all these countries were one thing or the other. Some of them actually integrated human rights very much, some of them did not. But the issue is also that the 50s and the 60s are fundamentally different in this system of states. So if the 50s was very strongly on the anti-colonial side, the 1960s is a decade where you have the colonial, the anti-colonial, and the post-colonial meeting and overlapping, and the UN is a really important forum for this dynamics. So as some of these movements became states, they engaged in diplomacy in different ways. So we have to be able to manage all this nuance. It's complex to have to be able to kind of see the differences between Liberian UN policy, Nigerian UN policy, Ghanaian, and kind of, but it's important sometimes when we look at this type of agency and the way kind of that it was not a bloc always acting, even though they could vote together, but there's all these types of things going on. And again, keep on pushing both the East and the West in this diplomacy. So back to race and religion. We're in 1965 now. We're gradually moving forward, and I'm slowly running out of time. So from 1965, when we have this Convention on Racial Discrimination, suddenly something happens because we've created this precedent of turning human rights into international law. And the next year, the two covenants on civil political rights and economic social rights are adopted. They're finalized and adopted in one session. They had been faltering for 17 years, but because of this really significant push, and when you look at the negotiations in the 1966 session at the UN, they're constantly referring to this precedent that was created the year before. And why is that important? Well, it means that, for example, the communist world entered into or adopted Convention on Civil Political Rights. So in a sense, by looking at the story of the Race Convention, we see that it impacted on getting the broader set of rights in place. So one of the really strategic contributions of these key states from the Global South was that they pulled the communist world into the world of human rights diplomacy and forced them to go much further than they really wanted, because they were pursuing for opportunist reasons, also principled reasons, but the agenda on racial discrimination, but they got a lot more than they bargained for. What is also interesting, and this is again some of these kind of counterintuitive elements in the story, was when they were negotiating the implementation measures for economic, social, and cultural rights, the state that wanted to go furthest in terms of implementation measures means reporting and accountability to a UN treaty body was the United States. They wanted to go furthest on accountability measures for economic social rights, followed by Italy. And the states that were against were, for example, the communist world. So this is again where this story of dividing civil political rights, economic social rights into neat boxes of West and East does not really fit. Because the story runs counter to some of these elements. And this was a really important moment in terms of creating a system for monitoring and reporting on economic social rights. And it was the US that wanted to go the furthest. Now, you might be wondering what happened to this 1967, in 1967, and what happened to this Convention on Religious Intolerance. Because I guess that none of you have really heard of it, and it's with good reason, because the chapter I have it on my book is the first time that the political history of this convention has been written. A lot of countries, a lot of actors around this think that it'll be possible to finalize this convention at the 1967 session of the UN General Assembly. And when the Commission on Human Rights meets in the spring of '67, they actually prepare the final draft, which is being sent on to the General Assembly. And there's been this precedent for the last 2 years, 3 major conventions have been finalized. But something happens between the spring and the autumn of 1967. And this is where global politics and international conflict intervenes, because the Six-Day War in the Middle East in June fundamentally changes the dynamics of the human rights diplomacy at this point. There's already been a case over South Africa and their management of Southwest Africa and Namibia where a couple of African states tried to use the International Court of Justice to secure that South Africa would not expand apartheid to Southwest Africa, and the court said, we can't hear this case after 5 years of proceedings. And this is one of the times where a disillusionment starts coming in against the international system, the international organization, and using measures like the UN to secure international justice. But there's a fundamental different dynamic that comes after the Six-Day War. And when this convention is negotiated at the General Assembly, the Soviet Union makes an alliance with the Arab states and starts turning all the elements of this convention into something negative. And at that point, the project kind of has to be given up. So we were really, really close. And this is a little bit counterfactual, but it has merit, I think, to have a up to 40-year, maybe even more practice in the international system of managing, debating, monitoring violations around religious intolerance and at the same time promote religious intolerance. It's like you could say that there is, out of the 1960s, kind of a human rights body created where we have civil, political rights, economic, social rights as part of the limbs, race is part of the limbs, and religion almost became part of this body. But instead, it was kind of cut off because of global politics. And the way we are challenged with managing religious conflict today, it's like the phantom pains of our global body politic in some ways that we have, because it was fundamental in this process of 1960 to have religion part of it, because it actually meant that the UK and the US started to engage with binding human rights policy. The UK only in 1966 acknowledges that human rights is a legitimate issue of international concern. This is not the normal story you hear from the UK when they say, we invented the Magna Carta and everything else since then. So we kind of, no, they're actually in some ways a latecomer to the binding aspects, the legal aspects of human rights. And it's very clear from looking through the archives that the fact that religion was part of this turning point made them engage. At the same time, they were losing more and more colonies, and that also made it easier for them. So decolonization also had that effect on the Western countries. Okay, so how does this all play together in the larger context of the human rights story? I should say that Jamaica created a range of alliances, and not just did they push the legal project and the political project, they also reached out to NGOs. And this idea that got more and more meat on the bones of a human rights year in 1968 also was backed up by having the first World Conference on Human Rights also in 68. So this was a Jamaican idea, a 3-week meeting that took place in Tehran in 68 and became one of the key events of the year. But Jamaica also influenced many other ways. They brought NGOs much more into the UN's human rights work. They tried to liaise with regional mechanisms, and they also proposed creating a National Human Rights Commission in 1966 as part of the Convention on Civil and Political Rights. And they had a discussion in Parliament in 68 about creating such a parliament, which is quite refined because Denmark, we think we were there as one of the first, and we only created our commission in 87. So there's an incredible richness in some of these countries' engagement with the human rights issues, which starts faltering towards the late 60s when military coups and authoritarianism becomes the order of the day in a number of these countries. And that's also why we haven't really understood fully why this Global South contribution to the human rights kind of system, work, politics, diplomacy has been so pivotal, because they die out in many ways by 1970. So to make a long story short, from a distance we can see that Jamaica and its closest Global South partners, I mean, again, countries like Ghana and Philippines, Liberia and Costa Rica, delivered the Human Rights Project on the doorstep of the 1970s. This was a decade where Amnesty International, Chile, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, campaigns against torture and forced disappearances, as well as the Helsinki process, would further define the meaning of human rights. Only the connections between these well-known developments of the 1970s and their roots in international human rights diplomacy in the 1960s have never really been drawn. Decolonization also influenced the ability of Western states to adapt human rights more fully, or as the historian of political ideas, Jan Werner Müller, has rightfully observed in his study of 20th century European political thought, quote, decolonization was a precondition that Europe might again be associated with and worthy of an egalitarian universalism. This subtly links the 1960s and the 1970s, and it helps explain why we need to bridge this chasm that has been between the 40s and the 70s, because there's so much that was that happened in the 50s and the 60s politics. There's system, there's law, there's also this engagement with NGOs. And the Jamaica-led process of the human rights year was the time, for example, when Amnesty adopted in 68 torture as part of the mandate. And that became really significant in the 1970s. the Soviet dissidents in 1968, when they started really embracing human rights, they built on this platform of the International Human Rights Year because the Soviet Union had endorsed it at the UN. So again, this Jamaica, of course they couldn't plan this, but they were also initiating a whole kind of shift of norms, what I call kind of reconstruction of global values, and it gradually took hold. And this is where I mentioned that they brought it on the doorstep of the 1970s, where we brought all these other elements. And if we look, for example, if we read the Helsinki Final Act and how the human rights provisions came into that, it is actually very closely linked to this process in the 1960s of redefining or defining anew the principles of international law, because that led to a UN declaration from 1970 that reads as a template. So if you want to understand how an important component of what led to the end of the Cold War in Europe from the mid-70s and 80s, we have to go back and understand Liberian constitutional history, Jamaican multilateral diplomacy, and this fundamental shift in norms that came with decolonization. And that puts also the end of the Cold War in Europe in a somewhat different light when we connect these stories in time and space. I think I should stop here.
Wow, that was a tour de force. I think we have all learned a lot, and we will learn even more. But first, let's take 10 minutes to stretch our legs, recharge our glasses, and eat the rest of the cakes. And then we reassemble, and for a half an hour of questions and answers. And please, we try to have this session as sharp as possible, so think a little bit how you want to articulate your question, and try and give Professor Jensen a run for his money. Thank you.
Okay, tack.